The barn smelled of horse sweat and old timber scents Ruth Hendricks had learned to associate with survival rather than honest work. Afternoon light slanted through gaps in the warped plank walls, casting golden bars across the dirt floor where straw lay scattered. She sat on a hay bale near the center, her calico dress torn at the shoulder seam, dust and grime streaking her forearms. Her red hair, once pinned with the careful precision of a telegraph operator who understood the value of order, now hung in damp strands against her neck. In her arms, Oscar and Victor slept with the boneless trust that only 3-year-old children possess. Their small bodies were warm against her chest, their breathing slow and even. She had been scrubbing tacks since before dawn, earning $2 and the promise of another day's work from a foreman who had not asked her name. That namelessness was a blessing in Thunder Valley, where questions led to answers and answers led to nooses. The twins stirred, murmuring in their sleep. Ruth adjusted her grip carefully, shifting Oscar's weight so his head rested more comfortably. Her back ached from hours bent over saddles and bridles, her hands raw from lye soap. But the boys were fed dried beef and hard biscuits, and they were here close enough to touch. That was all that mattered in this moment between past horrors and future dangers. A figure materialized in the barn's broad doorway, backlit by harsh afternoon sun that turned the Dakota Territory into bleached earth and pale sky. Ruth's head snapped up, her breath catching. Her pulse hammered so hard she felt it in her temples, her wrists, the base of her skull. A man stood framed in the entrance, tall and utterly still. He wore buckskin leggings showing wear at the knees and a modest eagle feather war bonnet that fell only to his shoulders, not the dramatic sweep of feathers from Eastern newspapers, but something practical, each feather, tied with small leather strips. A beaded bone breastplate covered his chest, the tubes catching light like polished ivory. His left hand rested near a bow slung across his back. A Winchester 1873 rifle leaned against the doorframe, its brass receiver dulled by use. Lakota. Ruth's mind raced. She knew this man, though they had never met. Chaska, the broken promise. Stories painted him as a ghost who moved through nights, cutting fences and freeing horses, a man who had once been a translator at the agency, who had vouched for treaties written in ink that dried to ash. Some whispered he was a killer. Others said he was already dead, just a spirit seeking revenge. The truth, Ruth suspected, lived somewhere between myth and reality. In gray areas where desperation met principle and survival meant impossible choices. Chaska stepped into the barn with movements so fluid they seemed unnatural. His moccasins made no sound on packed earth. His gaze swept the interior, horses shifting in stalls, saddles hung on wooden pegs, the pile of oiled tack Ruth had set aside before settling on her with intensity that made her skin prickle. His eyes were dark, almost black, and completely unreadable. Ruth tightened her arms around the twins instinctively. She had no weapon. The pitchfork leaned against the far wall, 10 feet away, too far to reach, before he could close the distance. The boys were too small to run, too young to understand danger until it bared teeth. If this man wanted to kill her, there was nothing she could do. She would die here in the dust and straw, and her sons would be orphaned, and Elias Brandt would have won after all. But Chaska did not draw his rifle. He did not reach for the knife sheathed at his belt and the handle worn smooth from use. He simply stopped 5 paces from the hay bale, his head tilted slightly, studying her, with the focused attention of a man reading a ledger filled with careful notations and hidden meanings. His gaze dropped to the sleeping twins, lingered there for a heartbeat that stretched like pulled taffy, then rose again to her face. "You clean barns," he said. His voice was low, rough-edged, like sandpaper on wood, the English clear, but shaped by a different tongue underneath. Ruth swallowed hard. "I do." "You are not from here?" Not a question. His eyes narrowed slightly, taking in details, her hands rough, but showing delicate finger movements of someone who worked with small mechanisms. The way she held the children protective, but practiced. The exhaustion etched around her eyes that spoke of weeks or months of running. Ruth said nothing. Silence was safer than lies. Chaska's attention shifted. He moved toward the far wall where planks sagged slightly warped by years of rain and summer heat. Ruth's stomach dropped. The ledger. She had hidden it there just 2 hours ago, tucked carefully behind a loose board near the third stall while the foreman was occupied. If he found it, a horse in the nearest stall whinnied sharply, startling against the quiet. The animal's hooves crashed against the wooden partition. The twins jerked awake simultaneously, blinking in confusion. Victor let out a thin, frightened wail that echoed off the rafters. Oscar pressed his face hard into Ruth's shoulder, his small hands fisting in her dress. The ledger tumbled from its hiding spot, hitting the dirt floor with a dull thud. Time seemed to slow. Chaska froze mid-step, then knelt with controlled grace, picking up the leather-bound book. Dust puffed up around his knees. He opened it, his fingers careful on the pages, and Ruth watched his face with the desperate attention of someone watching a jury foreman deliver a verdict. She saw the exacted moment recognition struck. His jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath skin. His thumb traced the edge of a page with deliberate slowness and then stopped. He tilted the book toward light, streaming through wall gaps, his eyes narrowing to slits. The pinprick marks. Tiny, deliberate holes punched into margins in clusters that would look like random damage to anyone who did not know what they were seeing. Dots and dashes forming patterns, a code only 2 people in the Dakota Territory could read, with full understanding. Jacob had taught her Morse when they married back when the telegraph shack had been her domain, and the world had felt like a place that could be mapped and understood. Later, Chaska had taught Jacob a cipher variation, a way of using Morse patterns to encode Lakota treaty terms for agency reports. Ruth had taken that cipher and used it to document every stolen shipment, every bribe, every lie that had flowed through Red Willow Ranch like water through a broken dam. Chaska looked up at her. His expression had changed, shifting from unreadable to something sharper, anger, yes, but also shocked recognition that bordered on disbelief. Outside hoofbeats clattered on the packed road, growing louder. Heavy bootsteps thudded closer, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and low rumble of men's voices. Her heart lurched sideways in her chest. "Quiet," Chaska whispered, barely audible over approaching danger. He moved between her and the doorway, with 2 swift steps, positioning himself, so slanting light fell on him, not her. His body became a shield, deliberate and unmistakable. Bram Lockett pushed through the entrance, like a man entering a saloon he owns. He was broad through the shoulders, thick through the middle, his face flushed red from heat and probably whiskey. In his right hand, he carried a branding iron, and the tip still glowing faint orange from the forge outside, heat shimmering above the metal. Lockett stopped when he saw Chaska. Surprise flashed across his face, then twisted into fury. "Tarnation," he spat. "You got nerve showing up here, Redskin." Chaska said nothing. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, palms turning outward to show they were empty, a gesture of non-aggression that somehow still conveyed absolute readiness. "Wrong barn," Chaska said simply. Lockett's lip curled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Wrong territory, you mean?" He swung the branding iron in a lazy, threatening arc, testing its weight. "You come here to steal more horses, or maybe you figured you'd help yourself to the widow while you're at it." Ruth's breath hitched audibly. She pressed the twins closer, feeling their small bodies tremble. Chaska stepped forward just 1 measured pace, his posture loose but coiled. "I came for what is mine, or what is. Nothing here belongs to you." "You are wrong about that." Lockett lunged with surprising speed. The iron hissed through air in a vicious arc aimed at Chaska's head. Chaska sidestepped with fluid economy, his body angling just far enough to let the iron pass close enough to feel its heat. His boot shot out, connecting with a wooden bucket sitting near the stall gate. The bucket toppled, splashing foul mixture of water and horse urine across the packed dirt floor. The liquid hit the glowing tip with a sharp hiss and plume of acrid steam, dousing the ember completely. Lockett cursed a string of profanity that would make a mule skinner proud, stumbling backward as steam rose around his boots. Chaska did not press, the attack did not move to strike, while his opponent was off balance. He simply held his ground, eyes fixed on the foreman with unwavering focus. Ruth felt something shift inside her chest. Recognition of honor, of restraint, where violence would have been easier. The pitchfork leaned against the wall to her right, close enough to reach. She slid it toward Chaska, with the toe of her boot metal tines scraping softly across dirt. Chaska glanced down at the pitchfork. For a heartbeat, his eyes met hers, a question and acknowledgement passing between them without words. Then he shook his head, almost imperceptibly. Too loud, too obvious, too likely to escalate into bloodshed that would bring more men running. Instead, he shifted his weight forward slightly, angling his body to keep Lockett's attention focused entirely on him, not on the woman, and her children huddled behind him. Lockett wiped steam and sweat from his face with his sleeve, his chest heaving. His gaze darted to Ruth, lingered there with speculation that made her skin crawl, then snapped back to Chaska. Brant's gonna hear about this. You can count on that. Good. Chaska said, his voice flat and certain. Tell him Chaska was here. Tell him I know what he has done. Lockett spat a thick stream of tobacco juice into the straw at Chaska's feet, the gesture crude and deliberate. Then he turned on his heel and stalked out into harsh afternoon sunlight, his bootsteps fading along with the jingle of spurs. For a long moment that stretched like pulled taffy. No one moved. The horses settled with soft snorts and rustle of straw. Somewhere outside, a crow called harsh and mocking. Ruth's hands shook so badly she had to clench them into fists. She looked up at Chaska, this stranger who had just placed himself between her and violence, without asking why, without demanding payment or explanation. Their eyes met across the dust-hazed space. She saw something flicker in his expression, recognition of a kindred spirit maybe, or the beginning of trust between two people who had both been betrayed by promises written on paper. He had protected her, not because he knew her, not because he owed her anything, simply because it was the right thing to do in a world that seemed to have forgotten what that meant. Chaska knelt again, picking up the ledger with both hands, as if it were something precious and fragile. He turned it over slowly, his fingers tracing the leather binding worn soft by handling the pages that had absorbed sweat and dirt and terrible secrets. Jacob made this, he said quietly, and there was something in his voice, grief, perhaps, or regret. Ruth's throat tightened until swallowing hurt. I made it. He taught me the cipher. You taught him? I finished what he started after Brant killed him for knowing too much. Chaska's gaze lifted, locking onto hers with sudden intensity. Jacob is dead. Yes. Brant. Ruth nodded once, sharp and certain. Chaska closed the ledger with deliberate care. Outside hooves clattered on the road again, closer this time, accompanied by raised voices. And they are coming back? Chaska said, his head tilting as he listened to sounds Ruth could barely hear. Can you climb? Ruth rose from the hay bale, the twins still clinging to her. Her legs were stiff from sitting her back, screaming protest. Yes. Then follow me. Quickly now. He moved toward the ladder that led up to the hayloft, a crude thing of rough timber nailed to the support beam. He climbed swiftly but silently, his movements assured. Ruth followed her progress, awkward and difficult climbing one-handed, while Oscar clung to her front and Victor wrapped himself around her back, his small arms locked around her neck, tight enough to restrict her breathing. Chaska reached down from above his hand, closing firmly around her wrist, and pulled with strength that seemed effortless. Ruth tumbled into the loft in a tangle of skirts and children's straw catching in her hair. The twins whimpered, but did not cry out. Chaska crouched beside her in the dimness, pressing one finger to his lips. Below the barn door creaked on leather hinges. Lockett's voice echoed through the space, harsh and angry, joined now by two others' hands from the ranchmen, loyal or frightened enough to follow orders. Heavy boot steps spread out across the floor, methodical and searching. Ruth held her breath until her lungs burned, until black spots danced at the edges of her vision. The twins pressed against her, their hearts hammering against her ribs in terrified synchronization. Chaska's body angled to shield them from view, below his arm, braced near her head, against a support beam creating a pocket of shadow where they huddled. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell the combination of sage smoke and leather and horse sweat that clung to his skin and clothes. Their breaths rose and fell in the quiet, not quite matched, but close enough that she felt the rhythm of another living body keeping pace with her own. Below, Lockett pounded his fist against a stall gate with a bang that made Ruth flinch. "Dadgum horse won't take the iron," he muttered, frustration thick in his voice. "Brant's gonna be sore about this one." One of the hands laughed, nervous and sycophantic. "Maybe that redskin spooked it. Horses can smell 'em, you know." "Maybe." Lockett's voice hardened like iron cooling in water. "Spread out. Check every stall, every corner. If he's still hiding in here, I want him found. There's a bonus in it for whoever brings me proof." The bootsteps fanned out, moving with more purpose now. Victor coughed a small hitching sound that seemed impossibly loud in the enclosed space. Chaska's hand moved with lightning speed, cupping gently but firmly over Victor's mouth. The boy's eyes went wide as full moons white-rimmed with fear. But Victor did not struggle. Chaska leaned close, his lips nearly touching the child's ear. "Hush, little warrior." He breathed each word deliberate and careful. "Be brave, and still like a hunter waiting for deer. Show me your courage." Victor nodded against the hand covering his mouth, his small body going rigid with effort. The barn door creaked again, and this time the sound was followed by the thunder of hoofbeats receding into the distance, a gallop heading away from the ranch toward open prairie. Lockett swore low and vicious. "Gone. Damn ghost moves like smoke on water." His bootsteps headed toward the door, the other men following. "Check the north pasture. He's probably after the new string." The voices faded. The barn fell into heavy silence, broken only by the soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls below and the creak of old timber settling. Ruth sagged, as if someone had cut her strings, her muscles giving out all at once in a wave of exhausted relief. Chaska released Victor gently, his hand lingering for just a moment on the boy's small shoulder, a gesture of approval for bravery shown. "You are safe," Chaska said quietly. "For now. But they will come back." Ruth looked at him across the small space. Dust motes swirled in the thin shafts of light, penetrating the roof boards, catching on his war bonnet, his breastplate, the hard line of his jaw. This man, this complete stranger, had just saved her life, and the lives of her children, without hesitation. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Chaska's gaze did not waver from hers. In the dim light, his eyes were softer, somehow less unreadable. "Because you have proof of what was done, and I need it to save my people from starving another winter." He paused, then added with quiet honesty, "And because leaving a mother and children to wolves is not something I can do and still call myself a man." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. Crying was a luxury she could not afford. The ledger. You recognize the cipher. I taught it to your husband. He was trying to document the theft to build a case that would stand up in territorial court. But he ran out of time. Chaska's jaw tightened. I did not know they had killed him. I thought he had fled. He never gave up, Ruth said fiercely. They murdered him when he refused to falsify one more report. They beat him to death and staged it to look like an accident. And then Brandt came to my door with forged debts and told me to run or hang. Chaska nodded slowly, processing this. You have been running ever since. For 3 months, until I ran out of money and choices. Ruth looked down at her sons. I came back because this ledger is the only proof I have that Jacob wasn't a criminal, that I'm not a forger. Without it, Brandt's lies become truth, and I hang while my boys end up in an orphanage or worse. And with it? Chaska asked. With it, I can send proof to Federal Auditor Phineas Hart in Yankton. He has jurisdiction over territorial corruption. If I can get him enough evidence, the ledger witnesses testimony, he'll come. And when he comes, Brandt hangs instead of me. Chaska studied her for a long moment. You would risk everything, your life, your sons' lives, for justice. I would risk everything to give my sons a future where their father's name means something besides shame. Ruth corrected. Justice is just the tool I'm using to get there. Something shifted in Chaska's expression, respect maybe, or recognition of someone as desperate and determined as himself. What exactly do you want from me? Ruth met his gaze without flinching. Help me get out of Thunder Valley alive. Help me send a telegram to Hart with enough detail that he can't ignore it. Help me find someone who will testify that Brandt paid them to move stolen goods. In return, I'll give you this ledger and a complete copy of the cipher key. You can use it however you need. Take it to your villages, to the newspapers, to the territorial governor. I don't care as long as Hart has enough evidence to arrest Brandt. And if we fail? Ruth looked at her sons, their small faces peaceful now. Then we die. But at least we die fighting for something that matters, instead of running until we can't run anymore. Chaska studied her for what felt like an eternity. Then he nodded once, decisive. All right. We have a deal, Ruth Hendricks. She blinked in surprise. How do you know my real name? Jacob spoke of you often, with pride and love and devotion that made other men jealous. Chaska's expression softened slightly. He said you were the smartest person he knew, that you could fix anything mechanical, that you had a mind like a steel trap, and a heart brave enough to match. He was right, I think. Ruth's throat closed up entirely. She could not speak past the lump of grief and gratitude that lodged there. She simply nodded, accepting the compliment and the alliance it represented. They waited in the loft as afternoon wore into evening, and the golden light shifting to amber, and then to deep blue-gray twilight. The twins woke fully, and Ruth fed them strips of dried beef from her pocket, giving them water from a small canteen Chaska produced from somewhere in his possibles bag. Oscar chewed his food methodically, watching Chaska with wide, curious eyes. Victor was braver, scooting closer to the strange man and touching the beaded bone breastplate with one tentative finger. Pretty, Victor said. Chaska smiled a small expression that transformed his face entirely. My sister made it, before she died. She was skilled with beads and quills. Where did she go? Oscar asked with the blunt curiosity of a child who did not yet understand death. To the stars, Chaska said quietly. To the place where the grandfathers live, where there is always food, and the winters are never cold. Ruth felt her heart squeeze. She reached out before she could think better of it, touching Chaska's arm lightly. I'm sorry. Their eyes met in the dimness. So am I. Wickenkala died because the annuities did not come, because men like Brant stole what was meant to keep her alive through the winter. His voice was steady, but Ruth heard the bedrock of grief beneath the words. I could not save her, but maybe I can save others if we bring Brant to justice. Ruth nodded, understanding completely, because she carried the same hope for Jacob's death. They were bound now by more than necessity, by shared loss, by the need to make meaning from death, by the desperate hope that justice might still exist somewhere in this hard land. As full darkness fell, they prepared to leave. Chaska went down the ladder first, checking the barn below. He returned and gestured for Ruth to follow. They moved through the barn like ghosts, slipping out through a side door. The moon was up a thin crescent that gave just enough light to see by, but not enough to make them obvious targets. They moved along the creek bed, their feet squelching in mud, the sound of running water covering any noise they made. The willows formed a tunnel of shadow overhead. Oscar rode on Ruth's hip. Chaska carried Victor with easy strength. Thunder Valley came into view, a scattering of lights against the darkness. Chaska stopped at the edge of the livery, crouching low, scanning the street with patient attention. A drunk stumbled out of the freight office, singing off-key, and collapsed in the dirt. No one came to help him. Where first? Chaska asked quietly. The schoolhouse. Mary Walsh will help us. They waited until the street was clear, then moved fast and low, keeping to shadows. Chaska positioned himself between Ruth and the open street without making it obvious. They slipped around the back of the schoolhouse. Ruth knocked twice, paused, then knocked once more, their signal. The door cracked open immediately. Mary Walsh's face appeared pale and tense. Her eyes widened when she saw Chaska. Mercy, she breathed. Ruth, what in the name of... I need your help, Ruth said urgently. Please, Mary, just a few minutes. Mary hesitated, then opened the door wider. Get inside, quickly. They slipped into the schoolhouse, and Mary shut the door behind them, sliding the bolt home. The room smelled of chalk and old books. Mary lit a second lamp. She looked at Chaska more carefully now. You're Chaska, the broken promise. I am. They say you're a ghost, a killer. They say many things. Most are not true. Mary studied him a moment longer, and then apparently decided he did not pose an immediate threat. She turned to Ruth. What do you need? Ruth pulled the ledger from beneath her shawl and set it on Mary's desk. I need to copy the cipher key. If anything happens to this book, I need a backup record. Mary stared at the ledger, then at Ruth. You're going after Brant. Yes. You're out of your mind. Probably. Ruth agreed. But I'm doing it anyway. Mary shook her head but moved to the desk and pulled out paper and chalk. Do it quickly. If Lockett finds you here, he'll burn the school. Ruth worked quickly, her hands steady despite fear crawling up her spine. She transcribed the cipher key from memory, the pattern of dots and dashes that corresponded to letters, the specific markers that indicated numbers versus words. Her fingers traced the ledger's pinprick marks as she worked. Beside her, Chaska stood at the window, his rifle in his hands, now watching the street through a gap in the curtains, with eyes that never stopped moving. Mary moved to the back of the room, where the twins had immediately settled into the corner they knew. She wrapped them in a blanket and whispered softly. When Ruth finished, she folded the paper carefully and handed it to Mary. Keep this safe. If I don't come back, you'll come back, Mary interrupted firmly. You're too bloody stubborn to die. Ruth managed a weak smile. She looked at Chaska, and their eyes met across the dim room. We need to go, he said quietly, before the patrol shift. They slipped back out into the night. The telegraph shack stood at the far end of Thunder Valley, a small wooden building with a peaked roof and a single window. The operator, a man named Perkins, had left 3 days ago to repair storm-damaged lines. The shack would be empty until he returned. Ruth and Chaska approached from the alley, keeping low and moving fast. Chaska tested the door locked. He pulled a thin knife from his belt and worked the mechanism with practiced efficiency. The latch clicked open after only seconds. They slipped inside, and Ruth closed the door, her hands finding the familiar space by touch and darkness. She lit a match and touched it to the oil lamp on the desk, keeping the flame low. The brass telegraph key gleamed in the lamplight, its lever polished smooth by years of Ruth's fingers tapping out messages. Ruth sat down at the desk, her fingers hovering over the key with reverence. Chaska stood beside her close enough that his presence was a warmth against her left side. He opened the ledger and began reading off the information she needed. Car numbers, shipment dates, dollar amounts, names. Ruth's fingers moved on the key muscle memory, taking over, translating the information into the staccato rhythm of Morse code. The sounder clicked in response, sending her message racing along the wires toward Yankton. To Auditor Phineas Hart Yankton, Federal Office. Priority urgent. Annuity theft and fraud. Red Willow Ranch, Elias Brandt owner. Sergeant Thomas Pike, Army Quartermaster complicit. Lakota horses stolen, rebranded, sold to Army. Agency Clerk Jacob Hendricks murdered April 18th after discovering scheme. Have documentary evidence. Request immediate escort and federal warrants. Ruth Hendricks. Ruth paused, waiting. The line was silent except for the faint hum of electricity. If Perkins had mentioned to anyone that the shack would be empty, if Brandt had thought to post a guard. The sounder clicked to life, making her jump. Message received. Identity confirmation required. State your name and authorization. Ruth's fingers flew over the key. Ruth Hendricks, former operator this station. Widow of Jacob Hendricks, agency clerk. No authorization, but have evidence. Another pause. Confirmed. Hart will investigate. Departure tomorrow by special train. Arrival 5 days. Maintain position, if possible. Acknowledge. Ruth tapped out her confirmation, then shut off the lamp, immediately plunging them into darkness. Chaska's hand found her shoulder, squeezing once reassurance without words. 5 days. Can we stay alive that long? We'll have to, Ruth whispered back. They slipped out of the telegraph shack and back into the night. But as they approached the edge of town, hoofbeats thundered suddenly from the direction of the freight yard, at least 3 riders moving fast. Check the telegraph shack, someone's been inside. Chaska grabbed Ruth's hand and ran. The abandoned hilltop silver claim squatted on Thunder Valley's eastern edge like a monument to failed ambitions, a pile of shattered rock and rusted equipment. The slag heap rose 30 feet high, its slopes treacherous with loose gravel. It was dangerous ground, the place where Lockett dumped bodies, the place where rock slides could bury a person in seconds. But it was also ground Chaska knew. They scrambled up the loose gravel slope, their feet sliding on scree. Ruth's lungs burned. A rifle cracked the shot wild, kicking up dust 10 feet to Ruth's left. Chaska pulled her sharply right toward the embankment. They scrambled up, their feet sliding. Another shot rang out closer this time, the bullet whining past so close Ruth heard it cut the air. Chaska shoved her down behind a rusted ore cart, his body covering hers, as another shot cracked overhead, the bullet sparking off the metal cart with a sound like a bell being struck. "Stay down," Chaska hissed. He brought his rifle up, sighting toward the riders below. He did not fire, too much risk of bringing every man in Thunder Valley running. A 4th shot came from a different direction from the ridge above. One of the riders below yelped, and his rifle flew from his hands, spinning through the air. He had not been hit. The shot had been precisely aimed to disarm rather than kill. "Wikasa," Chaska murmured with satisfaction. The riders wheeled their horses and retreated, firing blindly toward the ridge as they galloped back toward town. Chaska helped Ruth to her feet, checking her quickly for injuries. "Are you hurt?" Ruth shook her head, unable to speak, past the adrenaline singing in her blood. Her hands were scraped raw from the gravel, her skirt torn, but she was intact. A figure materialized from the shadows above a young man, lean and wiry, with a Spencer carbine slung across his back. He moved down the slope with sure-footed grace. "Uncle," he said in Lakota, then switched to English when he saw Ruth. "You bring trouble as always." "Wikasa," Chaska said, and there was both warning and affection in his tone. "This woman is under my protection. She carries proof of what Brant has done." Wikasa studied Ruth with open suspicion. He was perhaps 20 with his mother's eyes and stubborn chin. "She is white. White women bring death." "This one brings justice," Chaska said firmly. "She has proof of the theft in a ledger her husband created before Brant murdered him. We need her alive." Wikasa's expression flickered. He looked at Ruth more carefully now. "You have proof. I have a ledger documenting 8 months of theft," Ruth said steadily, meeting his skeptical gaze without flinching. "Annuity shipments, stolen horses taken from your villages and rebranded, all of it documented in code. Your uncle taught my husband the cipher. I used it to record everything after my husband was killed." Wikasa stared at her for a long moment, then spat into the dirt. "She has spirit, at least." "She has more than spirit. She has courage and a mind that works like clockwork," Chaska said. "We go now to Silas Pike's homestead. We need his testimony." They moved through the night toward Silas Pike's claim. The moon climbed higher, painting the landscape in silver and black. Ruth's exhaustion was a physical weight dragging at every step, but she forced herself to keep moving. Silas Pike's homestead sat on the far western edge of the valley, a small sod house with a sagging roof and a barn that leaned precariously. A single lamp burned in the window. Chaska stopped at the edge of the yard. "Wait here. If he sees a Lakota first, he will shoot." "No," Ruth said firmly. "We go together." They crossed the yard side by side, making enough noise to announce their presence without seeming threatening. Ruth knocked on the door 3 sharp raps. Movement inside. Footsteps approaching with slow caution. The door cracked open, and Silas Pike's face appeared hollow-cheeked, unshaven, his eyes red-rimmed. He was perhaps 30 but looked 50. "Ruth Harper," he said, his voice thin with confusion and fear. "I need to talk to you, Silas. It's about Brant." Silas's expression shuddered immediately. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. You've been hauling wagons for him. Night runs to the rail spur. Horses that don't belong to him." "I don't—" "Silas, please." Ruth stepped closer. "I know Brant's holding your crop lean. I know you're scared. But you need to listen, because what I'm about to tell you is going to save your life, or end it." Silas stared at her, his face pale. Then slowly, he opened the door wider. "Come inside, quickly." Ruth stepped into the sod house. It was barely one room, a stove in the corner, a rope bed, a table made from rough planks. Silas closed the door. "How do you know about the wagons?" "Because I've been watching. I saw you 3 weeks ago. I saw you again last week." Ruth lowered her voice. "I sent a telegram tonight to Federal Auditor Phineas Hart in Yankton. He's coming here in 5 days with warrants and marshals. When he arrives, he's going to arrest everyone connected to Brant's operation. You can either be a witness who helps bring Brant down, or you can be a defendant who hangs alongside him. Silas's eyes flew open. The auditor, Hart's coming, and when he gets here, he'll want answers. You can provide those answers and receive immunity, or you can refuse and hang. Silas's hands shook visibly. If I talk, Brant will kill me. If you don't talk, Hart will arrest you, and you'll hang for someone else's crimes, Ruth said quietly. At least, if you testify, you have a chance. Silas closed his eyes, his breath coming in short gasps. Finally, he spoke, his voice breaking. Brant paid me in cash from an Army quartermaster's pouch. I kept one of the bills. It's hidden in the barn. Ruth's heart leaped. Physical evidence, exactly what Hart would need. Keep it safe. When Hart arrives, I'll need you to show it to him. Silas nodded slowly. I'll testify. I don't want to hang. The next 3 days passed in a blur of hiding and planning, of near misses and desperate gambits. They hid in a soddy during daylight hours when Brant's men searched. At night, they moved, gathering more evidence, securing more witnesses. Dr. Eli Turner agreed to photograph the ledger pages using his wet plate collodion camera. The process was painstaking. Each glass plate had to be prepared individually, coated with collodion solution, then sensitized in silver nitrate while still wet. Turner worked through one night, his movements practiced and sure despite the danger. He prepared the first plate, coating the glass with collodion, a syrupy mixture of gun cotton dissolved in ether and alcohol, spreading it evenly across the surface with practiced tilts and rotations. The coating had to be perfect. Any streaks or bubbles would ruin the image. While the collodion was still tacky, he carried the plate into his makeshift darkroom and immersed it in a silver nitrate bath, the chemicals reacting to create light-sensitive silver iodide. The plate had to be exposed while still wet within 15 minutes, or the sensitivity would be lost. Turner positioned the ledger on white cloth under the window, where morning light would be strongest. He arranged the camera, adjusting focus with infinite patience, calculating exposure time based on available light. Ruth watched, fascinated by the precision required, understanding suddenly how valuable this evidence would be. Photographs that could not be dismissed as forgeries. Hold the page flat, Turner instructed. Any movement will blur the image. Ruth pressed the ledger open, holding it steady while Turner counted seconds under his breath. 20, 30, 40. Each second felt eternal. Finally, he closed the lens cap and rushed the plate back to his darkroom, developing it in a bath of pyrogallic acid and acetic acid, and the image slowly appearing, as if by magic, the pinprick marks visible as tiny points of light against the page. It was Turner who discovered the hidden note while developing the fourth plate. He emerged from his darkroom holding a glass plate up to the lamplight, his expression grim. "There's something here," he said. "Something under this invoice stub." Ruth moved closer, her heart beginning to pound. Turner fetched a small knife and a bowl of warm water, working with surgical precision to soften the glue. Slowly, meticulously, he peeled back the stub. Underneath, in Jacob's careful handwriting, was a note. April 17th, 1873. Brant has ordered me to falsify the shipment reports. He threatened Ruth and the boys if I refuse. Said the widow will hang if I talk. I am documenting everything in the ledger using the cipher Chaska taught me. If anything happens to me, whoever finds this must know Elias Brant is systematically starving the Lakota villages. He is selling their horses and annuity goods and pocketing the difference. He told me yesterday that if I become a problem, I will have an unfortunate accident, and Ruth will be blamed for debts that don't exist. This ledger is the only proof that will save her if I die. To whoever finds this, Elias Brant murdered me, and he will murder her too, unless you stop him. Jacob Hendricks. The words blurred as Ruth's eyes filled with tears. Her chest constricted until she could not breathe. She had thought Jacob's warning, "The widow will hang," had been paranoia. Now she understood. He had known exactly what Brant planned. Chaska was at her side instantly, his arm around her shoulders. "Breathe," he commanded. "Ruth, breathe." She breathed ragged gasps that hurt her throat. Tears streamed down her face. Turner studied the note. "This is proof of premeditated murder. The invoice stub on top." He turned it over. "This is a forgery. Look at the date. April 20th. 2 days after Jacob wrote this note. 2 days after Jacob supposedly died on the 18th. Brant forged a receipt after the murder." Chaska said, his voice hard as iron. "Signed it in Jacob's name to make it look like Jacob was still alive to obscure the timeline." Ruth wiped her eyes roughly. The shock was passing, replaced by something else, something cold and sharp and absolutely certain. "No more running," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "We take this to heart the moment he arrives, and we make sure Brant hangs." But Chaska was frowning. "This proof is good. But Brant will know by now that we've been gathering evidence. He will move to destroy everything before Hart arrives. We have 2 days left. That's 48 hours for Brant to erase every trace. Then we force his hand," Ruth said. "We hit the rail spur where he's holding horses, document the altered brands before he can move them. We create so much evidence that even if he destroys some of it, enough will survive." Turner shook his head. "The spur is guarded. Sergeant Pike and his men are there constantly." "We create a diversion," Chaska said slowly. "The bridge at Knife River, if we make it look like it's collapsing, Brant will have to reroute any wagons. It will cause chaos." Ruth's mind clicked through the plan. "And while they're dealing with the bridge, we photograph the horses." On the evening of the 4th day, 1 day before Hart's scheduled arrival, word came through Wikasa that Lockett was mobilizing to move the horses that very night, to scatter them before the auditor arrived. And more, that Brant himself was preparing to leave Thunder Valley at first light. "We go tonight," Chaska said grimly. "If we wait, it will be too late." They moved at full dark. Silas drove his wagon through darkness toward Knife River, crossing his heart hammering. The wagon was loaded with rocks and scrap metal weight enough to stress the bridge supports Chaska had already partially cut. He reached the bridge just after midnight. The structure loomed before him. Silas urged his horses onto the planks. The wood groaned like a dying animal. Silas felt the bridge shift beneath him and threw himself from the driver's seat, just as the center span gave way, with a crack like thunder. The wagon tipped, dumping its load into shallow water with an enormous splash. The horses scrambled for the far bank, wild-eyed but unharmed. Silas rolled in the mud, bruised but alive. At the rail spur 2 miles away, the guards leapt to their feet at the sound. What in blazes was that? "The bridge," Sergeant Thomas Pike barked orders. "You two go investigate, rest of you stay with the horses." But 2 men leaving meant 2 fewer guards, and that meant opportunity. Ruth and Turner moved from their hiding position in the cottonwoods, carrying the camera equipment. Wikasa covered them from a tree. Turner set up the camera on its tripod, pointing it toward the corral. The darkness was a problem. The exposure would need to be impossibly long without more light. "We need fire," Turner whispered. Ruth grabbed a stick, wrapped it with dried grass, moved toward the guard fire, thrust it into the coals, waited precious seconds for it to catch, then pulled it out blazing and ran back holding the improvised torch high. The horses shied away, but the firelight fell perfectly on the bay gelding nearest the fence, illuminating his flank, where a fresh brand showed clearly, and beneath it, the ghost of an older mark. "Now," Ruth hissed. Turner opened the lens cap, counting seconds, while Ruth held the torch steady, her arms shaking, the torch burning down toward her hand, heat searing her palm. But she did not move, held it steady through will alone. Got it. Turner breathed, closing the lens cap. But one of the guards who had gone to investigate returned at a run, shouting, "It's sabotage! Someone cut the supports!" Sergeant Pike's head snapped toward the corral, toward the flickering torchlight. "There, someone's at the horses." Gunfire erupted. Ruth dropped the torch and ran Turner beside her, carrying the camera equipment. Bullets cracked past them close enough to hear. They dove into the cottonwoods as return fire came from Wakasa's position. "Go!" Wakasa shouted. "I cover you." They ran through darkness so complete, Ruth could barely see her hand, crashing through undergrowth branches, whipping at their faces. Turner stumbled and nearly fell. Ruth grabbed his arm and hauled him forward. Behind them, more gunfire, more shouting. Hoofbeats beginning to thunder as guards mounted and gave chase. They burst out onto open prairie, and suddenly clouds parted and moonlight flooded the landscape, revealing everything. Ruth saw Thunder Valley ahead. "The barn!" Chaska's voice came from their left. "Red Willow Brant's there with Lockett trying to burn evidence." They ran toward Red Willow Ranch, toward fire and confrontation. The barn at Red Willow Ranch blazed like a funeral pyre, flames reaching 30 feet high, roaring with a sound like an angry god. Smoke billowed in choking clouds. Horses screamed inside the barn, animals trapped by flames panicking. The sound was terrible, worse than human screams. Ruth saw Brant standing in the yard directing the fire with Lockett beside him, both men's faces lit by flames. They were destroying evidence, burning everything that could connect them to theft and murder. "We can't let those horses die," Ruth said. "We go in," Chaska said grimly. "But we stay together." Turner grabbed Ruth's arm. "This is insane. The barn's coming down." "Then I'll be killed saving something instead of watching it burn," Ruth said, pulling free. She ran toward the barn. The heat hit her like a physical wall, searing her exposed skin. She tied a wet bandana Chaska had given her over her face and plunged into the smoke-filled interior. The barn was hell rendered into architecture. Flames crawled across the rafters. Embers rained down like hellish snow, burning through Ruth's dress. The smoke was so thick she could barely see 3 feet ahead. She found the first stall by feel her hands finding the latch. She swung the door open, and the horse inside bolted past, nearly trampling her. She moved to the next stall and the next, releasing animals that fled toward the entrance. Beside her, Chaska worked with the same desperate efficiency, cutting halter ropes when latches proved too stubborn. A beam groaned overhead, sagging dangerously. Chaska grabbed Ruth and pulled her sideways, just as the beam fell, missing them by inches, crashing down in an explosion of sparks. They kept working. 5 horses freed, 8, 10. The smoke was so thick now, Ruth could not tell up from down, could not find the entrance, could not breathe, without her lungs screaming. A figure appeared in the smoke, Brant, his face twisted with rage, a revolver in his hand. He raised it, aiming at Ruth. "You couldn't just die quietly." He snarled. He fired. The bullet went wide, thrown off by smoke. Chaska lunged at Brant, driving his shoulder into the rancher's gut, slamming him backward into a burning support post. Brant screamed as his shirt caught fire, thrashing away, beating at the flames. Ruth grabbed a horse blanket and swung it at Brant's gun hand. The heavy wool connected with his wrist, knocking the revolver away into burning straw. Brant staggered toward the entrance, his clothes smoldering. Behind him, the roof groaned. Ruth looked up to see the entire structure beginning to collapse inward. "Out!" Chaska shouted, grabbing Ruth's hand. "Now!" They ran for the entrance, as the world came down around them in a rain of fire and timber. A burning beam crashed down behind them, close enough that Ruth felt the heat singe the back of her neck. They burst out into the relatively cool night air, just as the barn's roof collapsed completely, with a sound like the end of the world. Ruth's lungs burned her throat raw from smoke, her exposed skin blistered. But she was alive. Chaska was alive. And behind them, staggering in the firelight, Brant and Lockett were alive, too scorched and coughing, but intact enough to face justice. The yard was suddenly full of people. Turner had rallied townsfolk, forming a bucket line. Mary Walsh was there, organizing women. And emerging from the darkness came federal marshals, 6 of them, armed with rifles, led by a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, who could only be Phineas Hart. Federal marshals. Hart's voice cut through the chaos. Everyone freeze. Elias Brant, you are under arrest for theft of federal property fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Jacob Hendricks. Brant, his clothes still smoldering, looked at Ruth with hatred so pure it was almost physical. This isn't over. Yes, Ruth said quietly. It is. The marshals moved with practiced efficiency, shackling Brant and Lockett. Hart approached Ruth. Mrs. Hendricks, I presume. Yes. You've been busy. Hart looked at the burning barn, at the freed horses, at the camera equipment Turner was protecting. I take it you have evidence. Photographs of altered brands, witness testimony, a ledger documenting 8 months of theft, and a note written by my husband before he was murdered. Ruth swayed slightly. It's all yours, Mr. Hart. Hart nodded slowly. You did good work, Mrs. Hendricks. Dangerous work. But good. He gestured to his marshals. Get these people medical attention, and someone find Mrs. Hendricks' children. Sergeant Thomas Pike emerged from the darkness, then his uniform dusty, his face set with resignation. He walked up to Hart and removed his sidearm, offering it handle first. I'm Sergeant Thomas Pike, Army Quartermaster Liaison. I was complicit in the theft scheme. I'll testify to everything in exchange for leniency. Hart took the offered weapon. That's a start, Sergeant. The next hours passed in a blur. Dr. Turner treated Burns Ruth's hands and arms, Chaska's shoulder. Mary brought Oscar and Victor, who clung to Ruth with desperate strength. Hart set up a temporary headquarters and began taking statements. Ruth testified for 3 hours, walking him through the ledger's cipher, explaining each piece of evidence. Chaska testified about the stolen horses. Turner presented the photographs. Silas Pike produced the Army-issued bill and testified about the night runs. By dawn, Hart had enough evidence to prosecute 12 people. Brant was transferred to a secure wagon bound for Yankton. As they loaded him, he looked at Ruth one last time. Was it worth it? He asked. Ruth met his gaze without flinching. I didn't do it for vengeance. I did it for justice. There's a difference. Justice, Brant spat. Pretty word for revenge. No, Ruth said quietly. Revenge would have been killing you myself. Justice is watching you face trial, watching you convicted by your own actions. Justice means my sons will grow up knowing their father died trying to do the right thing. That's worth everything. Brant had no answer. The marshals closed the wagon and drove away. The trial was held in Yankton 3 weeks later in a U.S. territorial court in Yankton. Ruth testified again, reading sections of the ledger, explaining the cipher, presenting Jacob's hidden note to a jury that listened with increasing horror. Chaska testified about the stolen horses and the starvation that followed. Turner presented the photographs. Silas Pike described the night runs. Sergeant Pike testified about the conspiracy. The defense attorney tried valiantly to create reasonable doubt, but the evidence was too solid, too detailed, too thoroughly cross-referenced. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They returned with guilty verdicts on all counts. Elias Brandt was sentenced to hang. The sentence was carried out 3 weeks later. Ruth did not attend. Justice had been served. That was enough. Hart settled his affairs before returning to Yankton. He met with Ruth one final time, handing her a bank draft for $2,000 and a letter of appointment to the Thunder Valley Telegraph Office. "You did extraordinary work, Mrs. Hendricks," Hart said. "Your husband would be proud." "Thank you," Ruth said. "What happens now to the horses, to the annuities?" "The recovered horses will be returned to the Lakota villages. The annuities will be audited and restored. I'm recommending Chaska be appointed as an agency liaison. He's proven his integrity." Ruth found Chaska later that day on a rise overlooking the Knife River. She climbed the rise and sat beside him. They sat in silence, watching the prairie grass bend in the wind. "Hart offered you a job," Ruth said finally. "I know. Will you take it?" Chaska was quiet for a long moment. "I do not know if I can work for the agency again, but I cannot go back to being the broken promise either. That man died in the fire. I need to be something else now." Ruth turned to look at him. "What do you want to be?" Chaska met her gaze. "I want to speak for my people in ways that bring real change. I want to raise Wicasa to be wise instead of just angry. I want to build something lasting." He paused, then continued quietly. "And I want to build it with someone who understands what it means to lose everything and fight to get some of it back." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes. "Chaska, I am not asking for promises," he said quickly. "I know the world will make it difficult. A white woman and a Lakota man, people will talk. But I am asking if you would consider if we might try to build something together." Ruth reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "I think we've already started building something. Through fire and blood, we've built trust. That's not nothing." "It is not nothing," Chaska agreed. His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "Hart gave me a job running the telegraph. $2,000 to start over. Enough to buy a small house, maybe with a paddock for horses." "A paddock?" Chaska repeated, the hint of a smile touching his lips. "For horses that need homes. And maybe for a man who knows how to care for them if he wanted to stay close. If he wanted to be family to 2 boys who need someone to show them what a good man looks like." Chaska turned fully toward her, his free hand rising to cup her cheek. "I would want that. Very much." He leaned forward slowly. Ruth did not pull away. She met him halfway, and when their lips touched, it was soft and careful and perfect a kiss that tasted of hope and new beginnings. When they pulled apart, Ruth rested her forehead against his. "The boys will need to know you. Really know you not as the stranger who saved us, but as someone who stays." "I will stay," Chaska promised, "for as long as you will have me." "What about Wicasa?" "Wicasa is learning. He saw justice served through evidence and law, not just through violence. He told me you have courage worthy of respect. From him, that is the highest praise." Ruth laughed genuine mirth after so much darkness. "I'll take it." They sat together until the sun began to set, painting the prairie in shades of amber and rose. Then, hand in hand, they walked back toward Thunder Valley, toward the small house that would become their home. Hart came to see them off before his departure. "You know this won't be easy," he said. "There will be people who disapprove." "We know," Ruth said, "but we've survived worse." Hart nodded. "Mrs. Hendricks, Ruth, you've shown more courage than most men I've met. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." He turned to Chaska. "And you take the agency job. Use it to make real changes, You've proven you can be trusted with power." After Hart left, Ruth and Chaska stood in the doorway of their new home, a modest structure but solidly built. The house had 3 rooms and a small porch that looked out over the paddock where horses grazed. Oscar and Victor played in the yard, their voices high and happy as they chased each other with wooden swords. Chaska had carved their laughter, a sound like healing made audible. Chaska emerged from the paddock, his shirt sleeves rolled up, looking more relaxed than Ruth had ever seen him. He climbed the porch steps and stood beside her, his hand finding hers. "The mare is strong," he said. "She will be good for the boys to learn on. Victor wants to name her Lightning," Ruth said, smiling. Chaska laughed, full and genuine. "Then Lightning she is." They stood together, watching their sons play, watching the future unfold in small, ordinary moments. "I love you," Ruth said quietly, the words still new, but true. Chaska turned to look at her, his dark eyes soft. "I love you too, you and your sons. I love this life we are building together from the ashes of what was lost. I love that we chose each other, not in ease, but in fire, and that choosing makes it real." He leaned down and kissed her deeper than the first kiss, more certain a promise sealed with touch and breath. When they pulled apart, Oscar was tugging on Chaska's pant leg. "Can we ride the horses now?" "You are both brave," Chaska said, crouching to their eye level. "Now, who wants to learn to brush the horse properly before we ride?" "Me," both boys shouted. Chaska led them toward the paddock, teaching them with patience how to approach the mare, how to touch her gently, how to earn trust. Ruth watched from the porch, her heart full, in ways she had not thought possible. The telegraph office would open in an hour. There would be messages to send the ordinary business of connecting Thunder Valley to the wider world. Ruth had work to do, a job that paid enough to support her family. But for now, she stood on her porch and watched the man she loved teach her sons to be gentle and strong, simultaneously watch the prairie grass bend in the wind, watch the storm clouds gather on the horizon, and felt no fear, because she had already survived the worst storm she could imagine. What came next would be hard, it always was. There would be challenges and setbacks, and moments when she would question whether they could make this work. But they would face it together, Ruth and Chaska, and the boys they were raising to be better than the world that had tried to crush them. And that was more than enough. It was everything. The ledger that had started it all sat in a federal vault in Yankton now. But Ruth had made one final copy kept locked in a small box under her bed insurance against anyone who might claim the story had been exaggerated. The story was real. The code was real. The justice had been real. And the life she and Chaska were building, strange and unconventional and difficult, was the most real thing of all, forged in fire and tempered by loss and held together by love, earned through shared danger and mutual respect. As the sun set over the Dakota Territory, painting the sky in colors that had no names, Ruth Hendricks stood with Chaska's arm around her shoulders and watched her sons learn to care for animals that depended on them, learning lessons about responsibility and gentleness and the kind of strength that came from protecting those weaker than yourself. It was not the life she had imagined. It was not the future she had planned. But it was a good life, built on foundations of truth and justice, and the stubborn refusal to let evil win without a fight. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Ruth allowed herself to believe that good things were possible, that happiness was not just a memory, but a present reality, that the worst was truly behind them, and the future stretched ahead, full of possibility. The twins called for her to come see what they had learned. Ruth squeezed Chaska's hand, once then walked toward her sons and the life they were all building together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of courage at a time. Behind her, The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the sound of children's laughter toward the horizon, toward tomorrow, toward all the days yet to come.